So, this new LeBron podcast came out. Let's talk about it now. First, I want to say this was an amazing podcast. If you guys didn't know, JJ Redick and LeBron made a podcast together. It is called Mind of the Game. Well, Mind the Game, really. And it is really a podcast based on having two basketball minds just really be able to speak and have intellectual conversations about basketball, about what it is, and about how it progresses. Meanwhile, also just having some fun and being able to chat it up in between each other. This is not a promotion for their podcast. I just watched the first episode, and it was one of my favorite things as a basketball fan. Personally, I get really excited about these things where I just get to see the game expand and where I get to see basketball as a whole be brought to newer audiences. And for a player of the magnitude of LeBron James to have a podcast is something that I thought I would never see. And that is just the reality. Obviously, it is very normal for players to have podcasts now. It's even normal for them to have a lot of success, like Paul George with his podcast P. We've seen Draymond with the Draymond Green show. But a guy like LeBron, the face of the NBA, and I'm sorry, but there's no holding back, even though he's had things like The Shop, we've never seen LeBron really be a podcast where you just sit down and talk about the game. And you can tell, like, this is not just something that is recurring because of, money or fame or whatever, because both of those guys are obviously going to benefit from it, but they're not gonna really have any difference. Those guys are rich, they make a lot of money, and you could tell that there's more of a connect to passion with this podcast than there is to greediness. And the reason why I say that is because just looking at the episode, you could tell that these guys really wanted to do this. JJ Redick, you could tell it's surreal for him to be on the same room and host a podcast with LeBron. Through this entire episode, you could tell LeBron is a larger than life figure. As much as a lot of people like to, throw shade at him, there is something to be said about having LeBron in front of you discuss basketball, especially when you're a basketball nerd. It makes it so that you look at the greatest player or second greatest player of all time, and you could just discuss basketball with probably the smartest player. The reason why all of this happens is mostly because of the phenomenons which are going around the league, and especially how that affects the NBA. The NBA is a place where smart discussions about the game are not normally had. They're left as a second, as opposed to having these conversations which don't really impulse the game forward at all. And I say that as a guy who makes videos every day about this. Like, I'm telling you that talking about the games, talking about the players is important. But speaking about drama in the league, speaking about the ant poster, which was something that I was going to get into, but I'm not in this video. To summarize, it was a great dunk. And I believe that it was very aggressive, and I love that for basketball. It looked great. It was amazing. But it's like, to have guys who can speak up about basketball at that level. NBA player who's played 21 seasons is the second or first best player of all time, depending on who you ask, and is the greatest game manager in terms of his IQ. Like, he sees everything, and we've known this for a while, but we've never really gotten him to sit down in a podcast just to analyze topics given to him by a host. And then you have JJ Redick, another veteran. He's obviously retired, but now a sports analyst, an NBA analyst, commentator, ex-former NBA player, one of the best guys in the league. And he just has an innate ability to get the best out of people when he talks to them, because he makes very good questions. He's very smart. He understands basketball. And I liked what they spoke on in this podcast. Now, to get into the subject matter, they spoke a lot about plays and about the modern NBA and what it takes to be a great player. First, they spoke on basketball history, knowing your history, knowing the past. And this is very true. You know, I don't have to be the one to tell you this when LeBron and JJ Redick already said it. But like, knowing the history of the game is very important to knowing how to play the game. Then they obviously spoke on having, you know, a good work ethic. Your mentality is very important. They said, like LeBron was talking about, squeezing the most out of yourself, that there's just some guys who don't need to do that. And that's the reality. There's some guys who don't work that hard, who don't need to squeeze the extra mile because they're comfortable with just their situation being it is what it is. Because I'm sorry, NBA players make a lot of money, and not everyone has it in them to be great. Not everybody wants that for themselves, and that's the reality. Then they also spoke on like plays and what icks them the most in modern basketball. You see, LeBron was talking about heaves at the end of quarters, just to get two shots instead of one, which is something that we see a lot now, where it's like we'll take a 40-footer with 40 seconds left on the clock to create two more possessions, so that even if they waste time, we get one more shot at the end of this quarter. They both disregarded this idea, and in the end, I do believe that it was one of, if not the most informative episode of a podcast in basketball that I've seen in a while. I think, apart from the Thinking Basketball podcast, which is another one that really dives deep into the intricacies of the game, and apart from maybe like the JJ Redick podcast independently, this is one of the times where we get to see high-level basketball being discussed on the microphone. There's not many people who can discuss basketball freely and still put up enough numbers to continue their platforms going. There's not a lot of guys who can really talk about the intricacies of the game and still be successful, because let's say for a guy like Stephen A. Smith gets up on First Take and starts talking about DHOs and screens, and starts talking about how positioning on the court and having an outlet player on offense makes your defense like a guy, but it depends on who it is. But if you run the zone, or like, if they would use these terms, if they would talk about these things, if they would talk even about something as simple as just what JJ and LeBron spoke about, like flipping a play, is something that a lot of people wouldn't understand and wouldn't be attached to. So that's why a lot of creators, a lot of voices have been outspoken when it comes to the subject of speaking of the NBA and speaking about the intricacies of the game. Not a lot of people can talk about Steph's dynamic shooting form and how he gets it done. A lot of people can talk about how Steph had 30 points. So in that regard, we could see that this podcast could serve as one of, if not the smart podcast, and a podcast to have real conversations about the game, not just some, overly verbose conversations which have to do more with individual skill and individual ability and team wins. I did like how LeBron spoke on other teams. He always kept it respectful. And I did like the way that he, was able to break down the intricacies of the game. I do think that hearing it from LeBron and hearing some of the things that he said are things which a lot of guys wouldn't speak on, and you could tell that he puts a lot of mind to. And it's something that is good for the game of basketball. It's good for him because he finally gets to go out there and just have a platform where he could just speak freely about the game that he loves. And it also creates a good environment where we could just have civil, smart basketball conversations which are not based on boasting or on disregarding or undermining players' abilities, and just focus on the game itself, the skill, the plays, and the way that the league is.